Story 1. Personally, after open-heart surgery, when they removed my chest drains, it was agony. As a nurse, I have cared for someone with acute pancreatitis related to their cancer. Story 2. Tooth infection. I was screaming and crying for days with no sleep and started banging my head against the wall. Story 3. When I was in college, I tripped and spilled a pot of boiling pasta water on myself. I then slipped on the water and fell on the floor, getting covered in boiling water. My entire right arm sustained second-degree burns, and I still have a mark where my metal watch melted my skin. My legs had multiple first-degree burns, but the worst part was that the boiling water soaked into my shoe and sock on my left foot. The top of my left foot was badly damaged. That day, they gave me pain medication at the hospital, so I felt pretty okay. It wasn't too painful initially. However, every day in the burn unit, they scrubbed the burns aggressively, I assume to encourage new skin growth and remove dead skin. I have given birth without medication. I pushed for 3 hours and tore like tissue paper, but having my burns scrubbed was an experience unlike any other. Story 4. Kidney stones. I would rather have another child at 59 years old than have another kidney stone. I seriously thought I was dying. Story 5. The worst pain I experienced was the 3 hours of discomfort after eating my last meal before needing my gallbladder removed. Story 6. I have been burned, frostbitten, cracked my head open on a brick fireplace, lost my big toenail by dropping a 1,000-gallon water tank on it, and had my finger get caught and burst open. I would prefer to experience all of the above at once rather than ever reliving a kidney stone again. Story 7. Acute gout involves tiny crystals that build up in your joints, often starting with the big toe. These sharp crystals can make it impossible to move the joint. Even a bed sheet touching the toe can cause intense pain. Over-the-counter painkillers often provide no relief. At times, the pain feels so unbearable that one might consider extreme measures to find relief. Fortunately, there are medications available that can dissolve the crystals and provide improvement within a couple of days. Story 8. Endometriosis has caused me monthly suffering since I was 7 years old. I received my intrauterine device 1 year ago, and now I am pain-free. Inserting the intrauterine device made me faint and vomit due to the pain for 3 hours straight. I also experienced gallstones and had a gallbladder attack 17 hours after the first one. Story 9. Breast reduction surgery felt like having a hot branding iron laid on my chest for 3 days. No one warned me. It was horrible. Gallbladder surgery was performed using an old method. I had all my toenails removed from both feet due to a terrible infection caused by my parents making me wear shoes that were way too small. It was extremely painful. The doctors needed to relieve the pressure on my toes, which were severely infected and swollen. They removed all 10 toenails, disinfected the area, and let them drain. I had large bandages on my feet and couldn't walk for 2 weeks. After lots of tubes and antibiotics, I was fine, but I couldn't wear closed shoes for several weeks. My parents were severely reprimanded by the doctors, and they never made that mistake again. Story 10. Natural childbirth where my baby's head was very large and I tore, requiring 60 stitches. I kept hoping to lose consciousness, but I was not fortunate. Story 11. When my intrauterine device was placed, I was blinded by the pain. I didn't even know that was a real thing that could happen. Story 12. I am having my leg amputated. The muscles and tendons are cut and pulled back, the bone is cut and shaved down, and then the skin, muscles, and tendons are pulled down and stapled over. Story 13. I had a spider bite on the inside of my thigh, turned black and became very hard. I called my mom because she is a nurse, and she said she needed to squeeze out the poison for it to get better. I lay on the bed while my brothers held me down as she dug her nails into the bite. I've never been shot, but I imagine it felt similar. It hurt so badly that I passed out a couple of times. I went to the doctor anyway, and they gave me some pills that made all the black substance leak out of my leg and some antibiotics. I don't know what kind of spider bit me, but it was the most painful experience of my life. Story 14. Endometriosis. Every month since I was 13, I have been unable to move or function for at least 3 days. Most doctors do not prioritize women's health, so I was advised to take ibuprofen and wait it out. I was finally diagnosed when I was 30 and received the necessary treatment to manage my condition. However, I endured excruciating pain to the point of nearly passing out for far too long. Story 15. Dressing changes for a woman who was caught in a trailer fire. Ketamine, fentanyl, and propofol were administered as she was still screaming. Daily dressings combined with occupational therapy are necessary to keep contractures to a minimum. Please check your smoke detector batteries. Story 16. I have epilepsy, and typically when I have a seizure, I bite my tongue hard for the duration of the episode. The tongue pain is unbearable and constant due to its location. It feels like a toothache on the pain scale and takes about 2 weeks to recover. From the moment I wake up until I go to bed at night, the sting is persistent. Story 17. Currently sitting on Reddit, trying to distract myself from the pain caused by my coil insertion over a month ago. Story 18. Ruptured gallbladder. I literally passed out from the pain. When they removed the drain tubes, they just grabbed them, told me to take a deep breath, and then it happened. Story 19. I had 5 gallstones, each the size of a quarter, one of which was lodged in a duct. During my first attack, I was absolutely certain I was dying. The second worst experience was when I tripped and fell 3 days after a cesarean section. I tore my incision open. Story 20. My uterus decided to expel the entire lining. It was a chunk of physical tissue, not a clot the size of a tennis ball. I was traveling in London, England, when it first happened. I was in so much pain that I went to the bathroom, threw up, and then lay on the floor while my cramps caused immense pain. Eventually, I expelled the tennis ball-sized tissue. Story 21. Gallbladder attack. I thought I was having a heart attack. I have had 3 children, and this was worse than labor. Story 22. A bus drove over someone's pelvis. The patient was alive but had severe injuries to the pelvis area. The emergency room surgeon attempted to stabilize the organs and prepare the patient for surgery, but he quickly succumbed to his injuries. Story 23. I have been writing about my experiences for 17 years. I began experiencing severe pain in my right maxillary sinus, accompanied by chronic sinus infections that required antibiotics every few months. I underwent 2 surgeries for this issue, but the pain only worsened and spread. To illustrate the pain, imagine large vice grips heated in a 500-degree oven, tightened against your cheek and the roof of your mouth, reheated and tightened every 5 minutes for years. I consulted multiple specialists, receiving various diagnoses and misdiagnoses. Each tooth on the right side of my mouth underwent root canal treatment due to a supposed bone infection, migraines, chronic migraines, and hemicrania continua. Then, electrical shocks began on the right side of my face, affecting the same area, around my eye, forehead, and extending towards my right ear. Within a year, the pain spread to my lower right jaw, resembling being stabbed repeatedly by a 14-inch butcher knife attached to a 240-volt, 50-amp circuit. These zaps could last from 30 seconds to over 5 minutes, escalating to as many as 100 per day, often overwhelming enough to drop me to the floor. I had to cease driving and working, frequently confined to the house, sometimes vomiting from the pain's severity. After about 5 years of suffering, a pain specialist recognized my desperation and prescribed high-dose opioids. I ultimately reached 32 milligrams of extended-release hydromorphone 3 times daily and 60 milligrams of oxycodone every 3 hours. While I disliked relying on them, they saved my life. After consulting multiple neurologists and advocating for a specific protocol for magnetic resonance imaging and magnetic resonance angiography, I took the films to a neurosurgeon. He confirmed my fears, identifying compressions on the trigeminal nerve from various vessels. The next day, I visited the director of the Trigeminal Neuralgia Center, who had extensive experience with the required brain surgery, known as microvascular decompression. I was overwhelmed with relief upon learning I needed surgery, and I asked the surgeon to provide the images marked with the issues. I sat in the car with my husband, in tears, for an hour before we could drive home. Unfortunately, while the microvascular decompression addressed the trigeminal neuralgia, I later developed complex regional pain syndrome. I also acquired a multi-drug-resistant strain of Enterobacter aerogenes in the hospital, resulting in 23 hospitalizations and 6 instances of septicemia. My surgery occurred in January 2017, and I still carry the infection. Additionally, due to my lifelong issue of sleepwalking, I fell in 2022 and sheared the ball off my femur, necessitating a total hip replacement. A month later, I fell again, damaging the hip replacement and breaking my femur in 19 places. This led to a second hip replacement surgery with an 18-inch titanium rod, 5 cables, and 7 screws, lasting 11.5 hours. I spent 11 days as an inpatient and 24 days in a rehabilitation hospital. The trigeminal neuralgia was the worst pain I ever experienced, not only for its intensity but also due to its chronic nature. The pain from my femur was the worst acute pain I encountered. Story 24. Gallbladder failure. The second worst experience was uterine fibroids deteriorating during my pregnancy. That gallbladder pain had me crying out for help as if I had been shot in a hotel lobby. Story 25. I experienced a 36-hour labor using only gas and air. My baby got stuck and I was pushing for 2.5 hours. The midwife was incompetent and unpleasant. A doctor intervened and performed an episiotomy without my consent, failing to prepare me or provide any anesthesia. The experience was barbaric, and the pain was indescribable. Story 26. Snapping my elbow backward in a judo competition was quite severe. I have permanently damaged it and still experience problems almost 2 decades later. Story 27. Toothache. My tooth felt like it had its own heartbeat, keeping me awake at night. Tears streamed down my face from the intense pain, and I was unable to visit my dentist for a few days since he was fully booked. I eventually had to undergo a root canal. I wouldn't wish that experience on my worst enemy. Story 28. An anal abscess made it difficult to sit or walk for weeks. I visited Norton's Healthcare and was misdiagnosed twice with an anal fissure. The experience was degrading and I would not recommend it. Story 29. My spinal block wore off during a cesarean section. Strangely, the worst part was my stomach muscles being pulled apart. The nurses said they had never heard anyone scream that loud, and many other patients on the floor were asking about me because they could hear it. Story 30. Grief. I held my dog in my arms for his last breath after the very difficult decision to put him down. For 11 years, he was my best friend. I could never put into words the pain of losing him that day. It has been about 3 months now. I think of him daily, but that day was the worst pain of my life. The weeks that followed were difficult. I have experienced loss and grief before, but nothing compares to this. Story 31. I know women have been doing this for thousands of years, but being in labor for 43 hours with a 9-pound baby was quite difficult. Story 32. It's between gallbladder failure and the surgery recovery from having it removed. The pain of a gallbladder attack is difficult to describe if you have never experienced one. It feels like an intensely painful cramp under the right side of the ribcage. Mine was triggered by any amount of fat. Nothing was safe, and my worst attack was from eating a bit of cheese. The surgery recovery was more painful than a cesarean section. Felt like my abdomen was bruised for months afterward. Took me a week before I could even sit up from lying down on my own. I had to hold a pillow against my abdominal area to help alleviate the pain as I stood up. For the cesarean section, I was given a binder wrap that I think could have greatly helped with the gallbladder surgery, so I'm not sure if my pain could have been less. Story 33. Rheumatoid arthritis caused a flare-up in every joint of my body. I was in pain and bedridden for nearly a month before it was under control, and it was worse than childbirth. Story 34. Osteomyelitis of the head of my femur was caused by an infection with methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. Story 35. Kidney stone. I have experienced cuts, broken bones, head injuries, and even a nail ripped halfway off, but the kidney stone was the worst. Started out manageable, but before they gave me pain relief, I was in absolute agony. It felt like someone took pliers, grabbed a chunk of my back, and twisted it as if it were attached to a drill. Thank goodness for the medication. I passed the stone without noticing it after 2 doses of pain relief. Story 36. Spinal headaches made it impossible to sit up or stand without intense head pain. It was very challenging to care for my newborn when I could only lie down. Story 37. Approximately 20 years ago, I had abdominal surgery. You've heard all the horror stories about general anesthesia wearing off during the operation. Yes, that happened to me halfway through the surgery. I went from sedated to unsedated in a matter of seconds and immediately went into shock. I didn't know pain like that existed in the world. Story 38. Personally, I experienced a migraine mixed with a wisdom tooth coming through. I was borderline suicidal from the pain. A close second would be pyelonephritis. As a nurse, I encountered a patient with 60% burns to the body and a ruptured eyeball who was briefly conscious. I also dealt with Stevens-Johnson syndrome and partial traumatic amputation of the arm. Story 39. I am a labor and delivery nurse. Watching someone give birth unmedicated when they do not want to, such as when the baby is coming out quickly and there is no time for anything, is incredible. Unmedicated birth is different when the patient is prepared and that is their intention. But when it is not by choice, they can become completely unrestrained, screaming, clawing, kicking, and biting. It is truly primal. The best part is that 10 minutes after the baby is born, they turn to you sheepishly and say, "I am so sorry for how I behaved." And I respond, "You have absolutely nothing to apologize for. You accomplished an incredible feat, and I am so proud of you." Story 40. Mine was when I had my femur shattered playing rugby. Every slight movement of my leg felt like a gunshot, and there was no comfortable position to lay without feeling a rush of pain repeatedly. Story 41. I had a knee replacement last year. I broke my jaw in 3 places. I am pregnant with 4 kidney stones lodged in my bladder. The placenta did not come out and was literally stuck after 3 of my 4 pregnancies. Story 42. I had a brain aneurysm. I experienced the worst migraine ever for 3 weeks. But thank goodness for modern medicine. Story 43. Last year, I experienced 3 severe thunderclap headaches in 6 days. I couldn't imagine enduring such intense pain without succumbing to it. But here I am. After my full hysterectomy, the pain medication from the surgery wore off. It was awful. The nurse was almost in tears asking the anesthesiologist for assistance. He said I needed to wait until I reached my room, where I would have a pain pump available for use. However, he forgot to order the pain pump. Story 44. My first fibromyalgia flare-up was intense. All my nerves and muscles were sending pain signals. The only relief I found was in baths and moments spent floating in the water. I cried almost every night, and the emergency room doctors were trying to understand my condition through multiple visits. During one visit, they administered fentanyl, and I finally experienced relief from pain. I requested they not give it to me again unless absolutely necessary. It was frightening to go from an 8 on the pain scale to 0 in just 30 seconds. I felt so good. 5 months later, I received a diagnosis and started several medications. Lyrica, Cymbalta, meloxicam, Tylenol, and lidocaine with menthol. I also have Norco for particularly challenging days. On a normal day, my pain level ranges from 3 to 4, but I can manage to function. Pain conditions are challenging for everyone. Story 45. As a nurse, I had a patient who was involved in a motorcycle accident. A car struck him, and he landed 40 feet from the site of impact. He broke almost every long bone in his body. When I received him from the operating room, he was essentially immobilized. Overnight, he experienced breakthrough pain, and we made eye contact right when it occurred. Story 46. Registered nurse here. Kidney stones, inflamed gallbladder, dissecting aorta, tourniquet above a knife wound to the aorta in the shin. The situation is serious, but I'm just joking about the last one. These conditions can be miserable. Story 47. A procedure was performed to block certain arteries to ensure that the lack of blood flow would eliminate the tumors in my body. At first, when I was coming out of anesthesia, the surgeon asked me, "Do you feel any pain?" I replied, "No." He then said, "You will." They wheeled me away to a room where the pain began. I was already on morphine, but it did not help. I asked the nurse why the pain was so severe, and she explained, "Well, we're killing something inside you, and nothing wants to die." She also mentioned, amid my moans and cries, that some people have reported it being 1,000 times worse than childbirth and have dragged themselves out of the hospital bed to the nurse's station, screaming for mercy. I did not reach that point, but when the doctor returned, I told him I needed the strongest pain medication available. He put me on a drip of a medication that he said made morphine seem like mere acetaminophen. He was absolutely right. After that, I sunk into bliss. This experience was quite eye-opening. I gained a much deeper understanding of drug addiction. I had some understanding before, but after this experience, I realized how easily it could happen. In the end, it was all worth it because those tumors were eliminated. Story 48. Toothache. I would gladly go through anything else again, but not that. I have to eat, and tooth pain does not go with that. Story 49. It's a toss-up between acute pancreatitis due to gallstones or a blocked bile duct caused by gallstones. I think the bile duct issue was more traumatic because of an infection, and I felt like I was dying. The pain from pancreatitis was more intense. A gallstone attack is worse than childbirth, and this experience was even more painful than a gallstone attack. Story 50. My dad is literally the toughest person I know. He broke his hip mountain biking alone once and ended up balancing on one side of the bike to continue down the mountain. He has broken countless bones, including his back, had a finger cut off, and had his nose broken. Yet, he still says the worst is kidney stones. Story 51. I had a testicular torsion that was terrible, and pancreatitis was honestly much worse. Good times. Story 52. Childbirth felt like the pain would never end and took over my entire body. However, when it comes to acute pain, I tore my Achilles tendon while running up the stairs, and the pain was so severe that I vomited. Story 53. I suffered a fully herniated lumbar disc. I remember a blinding, searing pain radiating through my entire lower body, causing me to collapse to the ground. I must have blacked out and came to in the ambulance, clinging to the nitrous oxide nozzle. It was all a blur of torment and sobbing. The next couple of months were incredibly difficult. I couldn't walk or sit, only able to move between a few semi-reclined positions while heavily medicated. I endured sciatic pain for months afterward. Childbirth felt like a walk in the park by comparison. Story 54. Heartbreak has led me through depression, and now I internally starve myself because I seek the pain and mental torture. I feel that no pain can compare to the long-term suffering that heartbreak can cause. Story 55. During my fourth depression relapse, I experienced one of the worst pains in my life, both mentally and physically. I found myself torn between wanting to die and not wanting to. Normally, I can distinguish between a desire for death and a need to escape, but this time I couldn't. I started making plans, feeling as if the illness had fully taken over. My body was shutting down as well. I couldn't breathe properly for over an hour. My chest hurt, my stomach cramped, and my head pounded. I contemplated going to the emergency room, but then I asked myself, why? Nothing ever gets better anyway. Eventually, when it became too overwhelming, I forced myself to call someone. A friend answered, and honestly, that phone call saved me. That feeling of total desperation was one of the worst kinds of pain I have ever known. Story 56. I am a medical student. The worst pain I have ever witnessed was someone attempting to pass a large kidney stone. It was terrible. Story 57. I had surgery on my tailbone area, not my rectum. They cut muscle and tendons. The spasming that occurred for the next week was by far the worst, affecting everything from the back of my knees to my shoulders. It was 25 years ago, and it still makes me shudder. Story 58. I experience constant pain in my hands due to arthritis and lupus. It never goes away, and I have to live with it for life. Lucky me. Story 59. Abdominal adhesions can occur, sometimes involving a loop of bowel around an ovary. This can happen a couple of days after a laparoscopic appendectomy. The pain can be severe, and some individuals describe it as worse than the pain experienced during labor or a cesarean section. Story 60. I have broken bones and experienced several other painful situations physically, but honestly, the worst pain I have endured was going through panic disorder. Story 61. Anal surgery for HPV was not as bad as I anticipated, but the inevitable bowel movement the day after was the worst pain I have ever experienced. I do not recommend it at all. I later discovered that I could have let my immune system handle the issue, but my doctor never informed me of this. Instead, I was told that it would worsen if surgery was not performed. They attempted other methods which did not resolve the problem, leading me to believe surgery was my only option. I should have pursued a malpractice claim, but I did not realize until a few years later that I could have avoided the surgery, long after the statute of limitations had passed. Story 62. Neither the second stroke nor the pain of being punched in my infected, broken wisdom tooth compares to the agony of having my sternum forcefully broken by prolonged sternum rubs while I was conscious, conducted by one nurse, one emergency room physician, and two emergency medical technicians during a cluster of seizures. I heard my own sternum crack over the sound of my screams echoing through the emergency room while I was fully strapped to the gurney. Criminal malpractice is rampant in Canadian hospitals. Story 63. I had a root canal once, but my tooth was so infected that the anesthesia didn't take effect. They ended up inserting the needle directly into the nerve. That was the worst pain I have ever felt in my entire life. Story 64. I am a nurse, but the worst pain I have ever experienced was when I had neuritis, which is nerve inflammation after shoulder surgery. Felt like I was being continuously electrocuted. I couldn't sit still or even think clearly. I just cried. I spent 5 days in the hospital, with relief coming only from intravenous Dilaudid. Even then, what really helped was that it put me to sleep, not that the pain actually went away. That was the first time I truly understood why someone would rather end their life than suffer to such a degree. If we didn't have modern medicine, I have no idea what I would have done. Story 65. After giving birth to my son, my uterus wouldn't contract properly, and I experienced excessive bleeding. The medical team had to manually scrape the inside of my uterus to ensure there was no retained placenta. I had given birth without any pain medication and then felt like a puppet while the obstetrician cleaned the raw wound on my uterine wall. That experience is my 10 out of 10 on the pain scale and what I compare everything else to. Story 66. Patients with gallstones and kidney stones cannot lie still in bed. They crawl around on the floor while I chase after them with medication to ease their pain. Ectopic pregnancies are also extremely painful. The trauma that follows when the adrenaline rush subsides is not pleasant either. Story 67. When I got my intrauterine device inserted, I had broken bones and all, but that IUD caused the worst, blinding pain I have ever experienced, even worse than getting my tonsils removed, and that was also quite difficult. Story 68. I once had a pilonidal cyst, and I was in tears. It was so painful that I couldn't walk and had to crawl everywhere, even going up and down the stairs. Even lying in bed and moving slightly was agonizing. Story 69. Kidney stones. I have had them 6 times over the last 30 years. The doctors and nurses always commented that it is known to be worse than the pain of childbirth. Eventually, I had a child myself and discovered they were absolutely right. Story 70. I was admitted to the intensive care unit with an undiagnosed infection in my left leg. Took 2 days to diagnose. The infection affected my artificial knee and spread throughout my leg. I had never known such pain existed. I spent 2 weeks in the intensive care unit. Story 71. I had a sty surgically drained. I felt nothing during the procedure. What I did feel for 25 minutes was the clamp used to hold my eyelid in place. The surgeon told me to stop being a baby since he gave me local anesthesia. It was the most painful experience of my life. Story 72. After having a steel plate screwed into my ankle, I let the surgical pain medication wear off before starting the regular pain medication. I found that catching up with pain management is harder than staying ahead of it. Compounding this was my second migraine headache. If the medication did not address it within a few hours, I had already decided it was not worth living to see the next day. Story 73. I cut my hand on a can lid while smashing down the trash. I went in to get stitches, and they decided to irrigate it to reduce the chance of infection. I'm pretty sure the person did it wrong, as the pressure basically flayed my palm, tearing the skin away from the rest of my hand. There was no anesthesia. Story 74. The worst pain I have seen someone experience was when my partner had an internal abscess near his tailbone. He couldn't stand, sit, or lie down, and it was during a public holiday weekend, so his doctor was unavailable. He was in tears and in severe pain. We went to an emergency doctor who contacted the emergency room ahead of us, and they prioritized us over a room full of others. My partner is a welder and very strong, but this situation overwhelmed him. The pain medication was so strong that the staff warned me about its effects when I picked it up. Story 75. Infected molar or pancreatitis. It's difficult to determine which was worse. Felt like death might be more pleasant. Story 76. Dry sockets after wisdom teeth extraction are worse than labor without medication. It was an incredibly painful experience. I felt miserable. Story 77. Getting my feeding tube stoma dilated to insert a larger tube. They used lidocaine injections beforehand, but it still hurt significantly. Story 78. I was shot through my thigh at close range with a .45 caliber bullet, and it went through my femur. When I dragged myself to the phone, I could feel the fragments of bone grinding against everything. It was extremely painful. Story 79. Sciatica attack from the depths of discomfort. I was curled up in a fetal position with sweat pouring off my body and soaking my hair. Story 80. Crohn's flare accompanied by acute pancreatitis. I remember almost nothing from the entire episode except sending genuine prayers for relief from my hospital bed. I lost 2 beloved family members during this time, which tripled the agony. I was completely convinced the world was ending. It was a full physical and emotional hell. Story 81. As a high school teacher, I have witnessed my share of tough situations, but the worst pain I experienced was when a student missed several days of school twice due to struggling with suicidal thoughts. That kind of invisible suffering is truly heartbreaking. Story 82. I had subacute bacterial endocarditis combined with a faulty heart valve, unknown to me or any doctor I had seen. It was initially misdiagnosed as strep throat. The doctor I visited performed a quick throat swab test that came back positive for strep. Since my body was cultured with strep, it came back positive. I lived with endocarditis for about a month and a half. I can try to explain how cold I was daily, but my descriptions won't do my experience justice. At one point, I wore 4 jackets, 3 sweatpants, a beanie, and gloves, and I was still freezing. My hands and feet felt like icicles, and all my fingernails turned blue from lack of oxygen. It was worse at night. My body temperature soared to 104 degrees. In the dead of winter, I woke up in bed, completely soaked with sweat down to the mattress through protective padding, overheating from massive fevers. My house temperature dropped to 56 degrees Fahrenheit at night, and I had to lie on the tile floor in my boxers for over an hour to cool down. I experienced extreme headaches, constant thirst regardless of how much water I drank, and my vision was questionable at best. I had strange kaleidoscope-like scans happening over one or both of my eyes. It felt like the light column of a copying machine scanning whatever paper you put in, but rainbow-colored, scanning across my field of vision for over 30 minutes. When I was admitted to the hospital after a doctor finally realized what illness I had following 3 urgent care visits, I was restricted to less than a quarter to a half liter of water per day. In 5 days, I had blood drawn every few hours with fresh needle pokes each time, totaling over 24 times, and I underwent a transesophageal echocardiogram. I remember it clearly because the nasal line for sedation partially came off my nose right after the procedure started. Overall, it was really tough. Story 83. My head at the end of a 10-hour shift after unknowingly having a cerebrospinal fluid leak for a month. I should have gone to the emergency room, but I doubted my symptoms and went to my primary care physician instead. It took another week to get a brain magnetic resonance imaging scan done, and I had basically no spinal fluid. My brainstem was sagging, and 4 millimeters of my brain was sticking out of the hole in the bottom of my skull. The pain I was experiencing was because my brain was not floating in liquid as it should have been. It's remarkable that I didn't have any neurological symptoms until the night before my blood patch when I experienced persistent vertigo. Story 84. Last month, I had 2 emergency surgeries for a gallstone that had been growing for about 6 years, resulting in a gangrenous gallbladder. I had been complaining to my doctor for almost a year. By the time I experienced serious problems, I was septic and in shock. The pain was quite severe. I endured this for 48 hours prior to my friend calling emergency medical services. I thought I could power through, as the wait times are so long at the emergency room, and I didn't want to sit in chairs for over 8 hours. Story 85. Post-thoracotomy pleural effusion. I underwent an epicardial ablation via thoracotomy, and I was the first patient they attempted this procedure on without a sternotomy. Because they viewed it as a minor procedure, they did not place any drains. I experienced a normal physiological response of producing drainage after surgery, but the fluid had nowhere to go except around my lungs. They actually tried to send me home the same day, but the pain worsened and I struggled to breathe. I was transferred to the step-down unit on 7 liters of oxygen per minute. Every time I attempted to take a breath, it felt as if my lungs were hitting a cement wall. The first night after surgery, I was in so much pain that I was involuntarily sobbing. They administered pain medication every 2 hours, but it only allowed me to drift off for about 15 minutes before I sobbed my way to the next dose. I developed a fever of 104 degrees. When I took my oxygen off, my lips turned blue. That feeling of being unable to take a breath without excruciating pain is seared in my memory forever. It took about 7 days to resolve. Now I have my reference for 10 out of 10 pain, and they learned that drains are indeed necessary for this minor surgery. Story 86. I work at a glass bottle factory making liquor bottles for various companies. 3 years ago, the machine malfunctioned and closed my hand between 2 900-degree molds, crushing all the skin on the top of my hand. I ended up with compartment syndrome and had 5 surgeries in the next 4 weeks, followed by a skin graft. I have to say that getting smashed and feeling everything burn for 7 seconds was extremely painful. The next 2 days with compartment syndrome hurt even more. I could feel everything burning and my heartbeat in my fingertips. Now I live with permanent nerve damage, which is challenging, but thankfully I regained most of my movement and didn't lose my hand. Story 87. I had a broken jaw, not just a fracture. I didn't realize how much was connected to my jaw muscles. I couldn't wash my own hair for a few weeks without help and was basically bedridden for about a month. Story 88. Trigeminal neuralgia. I have chronic pain and migraines and was hit by a minivan traveling at 60 kilometers per hour while crossing the street. Still, no pain has come close to trigeminal neuralgia. Story 89. I had a lobe of my lung removed. To prevent the chances of becoming addicted to opioids, they used an epidural for pain relief. However, it suppressed my breathing while I was in the recovery intensive care unit, so someone decided to turn it off. For 2 days, I was breathing with a freshly cut and stitched lung with every single breath until someone realized that I had not received any anesthesia and turned the epidural back on, despite my complaints about the pain, which they thought I was exaggerating. Having the chest tubes removed a few days later was nothing compared to being too scared to breathe because of the pain. The pain when my lung inflated and the remaining lobes fully expanded was immense. I say this as someone who has lost a toe, had pancreatitis, gallstones, and a kidney stone. Those were walks in the park compared to trying to breathe with a fresh lung wound. Story 90. I got shingles when I was 23. Every nerve in my leg was on fire. I couldn't sleep, so I just sat on my deck chain-smoking cigarettes. Story 91. Meningitis. I remember screaming in the emergency room, expressing my wish to die because the pain was unbearable. Nothing else can compare to that level of pain. It feels like my brain and spinal cord are too large for my skull and vertebrae to contain. Story 92. Gallbladder flare-up. One time I was vomiting out of the car window on the way to the emergency department. Of course, they didn't take me back for a long time, and I ended up vomiting in the bathroom. I felt better, so I decided to go home instead of sitting there. It was such a relief to have that thing taken out. Story 93. Uterine artery embolization. I have tattoos on the top of my foot and on the side of my rib cage. I do not have children by choice, but I would have chosen to receive an epidural. I was in so much pain that I cried for hours. My spouse was responsible for providing my pain medication. He inadvertently kept giving me laxatives instead of pain medication, which did not help at all. Story 94. A nurse was present while a patient who had set himself on fire suffered burns over a large part of his body. We were changing the dressings on his skin grafts. I almost fainted from witnessing the situation. This man was screaming. Story 95. Shingles covered my armpit and stretched onto my chest. I was 10 weeks postpartum with twins and breastfeeding. My husband thought it was poison ivy, and I just gritted my teeth until it got so bad that I went to the emergency room at 2 a.m. It was 3 months of agony, and I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. Story 96. My mother has trigeminal neuralgia. Her flare-ups are agonizing. The condition is also known as the suicide disease and is often regarded as the worst physical pain a person can experience. I wouldn't wish it on anyone. Story 97. Mine was probably pancreatitis at age 16 due to gallstones. I was yellow. More recently, I had rhabdomyolysis for several weeks, and when it was at its peak, it felt like every limb was being ripped away. I could not get comfortable. Story 98. I had an emergency cesarean section, and I refused pain medication because I have a family history of addiction. It was a horrible experience. Story 99. Sciatica is my top concern. I experienced a twisting, burning sensation in my left leg whenever I sat. The longer I remained seated, the more intense the pain became. It felt like a scalding blade was being inserted into my calf, twisting more the longer I stayed in that position. I tried to endure it, but driving became the worst since I primarily work while standing. When I finally went to the emergency room, morphine was ineffective. I am now undergoing treatment for nerve pain. They attempted back surgery to address the disc causing my sciatica, but it was unsuccessful. My third concern is gout. I cannot recall my second. It led me to a hospital due to a crushing headache and vomiting. Morphine was again ineffective. They never diagnosed it, but it eventually resolved. Their best guess was food poisoning. Story 100. I played lacrosse in high school. I was playing defense and helping guard our goal. A player on the opposing team took a fast shot that went low and hit me squarely. Lacrosse balls are very dense, and even though I was wearing protective gear, it knocked me to the ground, and I was unable to walk for several seconds. Story 101. 2 years ago, I had a compound dislocation of my pinky. The bone tore through the skin. While being driven to the emergency room, my adrenaline began to drop, and everything in my right hand became rigid and tight to the point that my fingers felt like they would snap backward. Story 102. After being in place for days, the catheter felt like a part of my body. It hurt to have it pulled out from my organ, and it even hurts to type this. Kidney stones are especially painful when they settle in the most sensitive areas. Story 103. Not me, but my tough grandfather, who never complained, had a really rough time with shingles. I am definitely getting that vaccine. Story 104. My experience of having a wart removed from the bottom of my foot was a perfect 10 out of 10 in a country that is not very advanced in medical care. Childbirth is a 9 out of 10. Story 105. I had 13 kidney stones and a cyst on one of my ovaries. 7 of the kidney stones were in the right kidney, and the cyst was on the right ovary. I experienced vomiting, back pain, and had difficulty walking because I was doubled over in pain. I would never want to go through that again. Story 106. I had a broken rib that caused an infection between the rib and the abdominal wall. I didn't realize it was broken until a week later while in the hospital. I also underwent a bone marrow biopsy, which thankfully returned negative results. Story 107. Kidney stones. Thank you to the staff at my local hospital for recovering after giving me an over-the-counter pain reliever for it. Story 108. I have had kidney stones and gallstones. I even had to undergo surgery to remove a kidney stone and had a stent left in for about a week. Nothing was more painful than when I discovered I had ovarian cysts after one burst. I was in so much pain that I vomited, I had a fever, and I couldn't take a deep breath. My brother had to carry me to the car to be driven to the emergency room. It was a horrible experience. They ended up putting me on birth control to shrink any other cysts I had. Story 109. I have lost a kidney and a piece of my lung in an accident. I passed 6 mm kidney stones and experienced 2 abscesses. I had Kawasaki disease as a child. The worst, though, was when my Lyme disease peaked. The pain was indescribable and affected my entire body. My hands contracted, making it difficult to open doors or bottles or manage personal hygiene. I am pretty sure I experienced a mental break while writhing on the floor in extreme pain. The mental and emotional pain is often worse, though. I have also been a nurse for 15 years, and we manage people's pain very effectively. Typically, the worst situations involve drug detoxification, where patients are not allowed to use opioids. Story 110. When I knocked my 2 front teeth out and had to have them shoved back into my gums 8 hours after the incident occurred, I swear no pain comes close to that pain. Story 111. I was about 16 at the time and needed my big toe to be removed due to it being ingrown. Well, lo and behold, he used no anesthetic whatsoever. My mom held me down while the doctor operated with a tool that looked like a combination of scissors and pliers. I was in agony. That was it. Story 112. Chlamydia. My left testicle was in so much pain, it felt like it was going to explode. I have never felt that much pain in my entire life. It started as a small lump on my left testicle. As it got bigger, it became swollen. I thought it was testicular cancer. I was relieved that it wasn't testicular cancer, but still, chlamydia is no joke. Story 113. Tooth infection and back pain had me screaming in pain, leading to a visit to the emergency room. Additionally, I had a kidney stone that caused me to vomit violently, lose consciousness, and wake up vomiting. Ironically, this was due to all the substances I tried to use to alleviate my back and dental pain in a restrictive environment regarding pain management. Story 114. I have fainted from period cramps due to fibroids and endometriosis, both of which have been surgically removed. Story 115. Getting a blood patch is a procedure that is performed when you experience a spinal headache, a side effect of spinal anesthesia. It involves taking blood from your arm and injecting it into a specific area of the spine to fill the gap created by the anesthesia. Story 116. I have experienced severe menstrual cramps that left me unable to move or scream in pain. I also occasionally suffer from migraines intense enough to make me cry from the pain. Story 117. I have trigeminal neuralgia, also known as the suicide disease, because it is extremely painful. It is triggered by normal activities like chewing, brushing my teeth, and touching my face. Luckily, flare-ups are rare for me, but they are very painful when they occur. I am trying to convince my doctor to prescribe me Botox to help dull the nerves in my face. A friend of mine uses it, and she says it works wonders. Story 118. Migraine, then toothache, then labor. Each is about 10 times worse than the next. I have had migraines that felt like an abscessed tooth behind each eyeball. My actual abscessed tooth exploded. So that is my scale. Now I have to discount those 3 experiences when rating pain because a torn meniscus is still only a 3 compared to those headaches. Story 119. The worst experience I had was a botched root canal when the dentist left part of the root and it became infected. It is difficult to determine what people's worst pain is in the medical field because their default pain level is usually rated 10 out of 10. It does not matter if it is a hangnail or a bone sticking out. It is always considered 10 out of 10. Story 120. The worst experience I have ever had, relatively speaking, was when I was 6 or 7 years old. While running, I fell and scraped my knee, and blood started to flow. When I told my father and he applied alcohol, it burned so much that I felt like my soul left my body, and I screamed loudly. Story 121. Tooth access made me feel like my head was going to explode. The infected gallbladder made me think I was having a heart attack. Story 122. Trigeminal neuralgia is known as one of the worst pains imaginable. My symptoms began as numbness and burning sensations along my jaw, lip, eye, nose, and ear. Then came the electric-like pain with every pulse. It turns out my carotid artery is wrapped around my trigeminal nerve, And over the years, my pulse has worn down the protective sheath of the nerve, resulting in unbearable pain. They want to perform brain surgery, but it worries me, and they mentioned it won't alleviate the burning and numbness. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.